It was a bright Tuesday morning in downtown Atlanta, the kind of spring day that promised new beginnings. Sarah Thompson, a 35-year-old black attorney, adjusted her rearview mirror and smiled at her daughter Emma, who sat in the back seat reading a book. The 8-year-old was already showing signs of following in her mother's footsteps, always curious and sharp-minded. Sarah had followed her usual morning routine, waking up at 6 a.m., preparing breakfast for her family, and getting Emma ready for school. Her husband, Marcus Thompson, had left earlier for an important federal court case. Little did she know that this ordinary morning would turn into one that would shake their community to its core. The streets were busy with morning traffic as Sarah navigated their silver Mercedes through familiar roads. Emma chatted about her upcoming science project, her enthusiasm making Sarah beam with pride. They were running ahead of schedule, and Sarah had planned to stop by Emma's favorite bakery to grab a special treat before dropping her at Greenwich Private Academy. As they approached the intersection of Maple and 4th Street, Sarah noticed a police cruiser parked on the side. She didn't think much of it. She had been driving this route for years and knew she was following all traffic rules. The police cruiser's lights suddenly flashed behind her, and Sarah felt her heart skip a beat. Despite being a successful attorney who dealt with law enforcement regularly, being pulled over still made her nervous, a feeling ingrained from years of hearing about traffic stops gone wrong. "Mommy, why are we stopping?" Emma asked, looking up from her book. "It's okay, sweetheart. The police officer probably just needs to check something," Sarah replied calmly, though her hands tightened on the steering wheel. She pulled over carefully, positioning her car well off the road for safety. Officer James Barrett, a 42-year-old white police officer with 12 years on the force, approached the vehicle. Sarah immediately noticed his aggressive stance and the way his hand rested on his holster. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay professional and calm. "License and registration," Barrett barked, not even offering the greeting. His face was set in a hard scowl, and he shined his flashlight directly into Sarah's face despite the morning sunlight. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over, officer?" Sarah asked politely, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. "You ran that stop sign back there," Barrett snapped, his tone becoming more hostile. Sarah's legal training kicked in, and she knew immediately something was wrong. There hadn't been a stop sign at the last intersection. There never had been in the 15 years she'd been driving this route. "Officer, I believe there must be some mistake. There isn't a stop sign at the last intersection," Sarah stated calmly, maintaining eye contact through her side mirror. Barrett's face reddened. "Are you telling me I don't know my own beat? Just shut up and give me your license and registration." Emma whimpered in the back seat, and Sarah could see her daughter's frightened reflection in the rearview mirror. She tried to maintain her composure, knowing she needed to handle this situation carefully, both as a mother and as an attorney who understood the law. "Of course, officer. My registration is in the glove compartment, and my license is in my purse on the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for them now, okay?" Sarah narrated her movements clearly, just as she had taught many of her clients to do. As she reached for her purse, Officer Barrett suddenly yanked her car door open. "What did I say about talking back? Get out of the car." Sarah's heart raced as she saw several bystanders stopping to watch the scene unfold. A young woman across the street had already pulled out her phone and was recording. The situation was escalating quickly, and Sarah could feel it spiraling out of control. "Officer, please, my daughter is in the car," Sarah tried to reason, but Barrett wasn't listening. His face was contorted with anger, and something else Sarah had seen too many times before: prejudice. What happened next would be replayed on news channels across the country. As Sarah attempted to unbuckle her seatbelt, Officer Barrett grabbed her arm roughly. The morning sun that had seemed so promising just moments ago now bore witness to a scene that would spark outrage across the nation and set in motion a chain of events that would change not just the Thompson family's lives, but their entire community. Emma's terrified scream pierced the morning air as Officer Barrett began to pull her mother from the car, neither of them aware that Judge Marcus Thompson's wife and daughter were about to become the center of a national controversy about police brutality and racial justice. The next few moments unfolded in slow motion as Officer Barrett dragged Sarah from her car. Her legs caught in the seatbelt, causing her to stumble. Instead of helping her regain her balance, Barrett used her momentary instability to force her against the side of the Mercedes. "Stop resisting," Barrett shouted, though Sarah was clearly not fighting back. Her only movement was an attempt to turn her head toward Emma, who was crying hysterically in the back seat. "Please, I'm not resisting," Sarah managed to say, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My daughter is watching. Please let me calm her down." Barrett responded by tightening his grip. "Shut up. You people always think you know better than law enforcement." By now, a small crowd had gathered. The young woman who had started recording was joined by others, their phones capturing every moment of the unfolding incident. A middle-aged man stepped forward, trying to intervene. "Hey, officer, she's not doing anything wrong," the bystander called out. "This is excessive." Barrett's face twisted with rage. In one swift motion, he spun Sarah around and wrapped his arm around her neck, applying a chokehold. Sarah's hands immediately went to his arm, her legal training forgotten in the primal need to breathe. Emma's screams from the car grew louder. "Mommy, leave my mommy alone." The little girl was pressing her hands against the window, her face streaked with tears. Through the spots dancing in her vision, Sarah could see more people gathering. Some were shouting at Barrett, others were calling 911. Her purse had fallen during the struggle, spilling its contents across the pavement. Her phone lay just a few feet away. "I can't breathe," Sarah gasped, the words coming out in broken whispers. Yet irony wasn't lost on her. These same words had become a tragic rallying cry across the nation, and now she was living that nightmare herself. Barrett's response was to tighten his grip further. "If you can talk, you can breathe," he snarled, pressing her harder against the car. Inside the vehicle, Emma had managed to unbuckle her seatbelt and scramble to the front seat. Through her tears, she spotted her mother's phone on the ground. She remembered what her parents had taught her about emergencies and knew she had to act. Emma quickly opened the passenger door and grabbed the phone. Her small hands shaking, she found her father's contact, a task she'd done many times before to ask when he'd be home for dinner. Now she was calling him to save her mother's life. Meanwhile, Barrett was shoving into his radio, calling for backup and claiming he had a combative suspect who was resisting arrest. The crowd's angry voices grew louder, with several people shouting that they were recording everything. "You're going to kill her," someone yelled from the crowd. "She can't breathe." Sarah's vision was starting to blur. Her years of legal experience seemed meaningless in this moment. She couldn't cite case law to the arm crushing her windpipe. She could hear Emma's voice in the background, speaking frantically into the phone. "Daddy, Daddy, the police are hurting Mommy. We're on Maple Street. Please come quick. She can't breathe." Barrett seemed to be feeding off the crowd's reaction, his grip becoming even tighter. "This is what happens when you don't respect authority," he shouted, seemingly oblivious to the fact that his actions were being recorded from multiple angles. A woman in scrubs pushed through the crowd. "I'm a nurse. You're going to cause serious damage." Her lips are turning blue. But Barrett wasn't listening. He was lost in his power trip, spewing racial slurs under his breath that the closest bystanders could hear clearly. He had no idea that every word, every action was being captured on video. He didn't know that the woman he was choking was married to one of the most respected federal judges in the state. He was unaware that his career, and indeed his freedom, were slipping away with each passing second. As Sarah's consciousness began to fade, she heard sirens in the distance. She prayed they were friendly forces coming to help, not backup arriving to support Barrett. Her last coherent thought before the edges of her vision went dark was of Emma, her beautiful, brave daughter who had the presence of mind to call for help. The morning sun continued to shine brightly over Atlanta, illuminating a scene that would soon become a national symbol in the ongoing struggle for justice and equality in America. Marcus Thompson was in the middle of reviewing case documents when his phone rang. The moment he heard his daughter's terrified voice, the distinguished federal judge transformed into a father racing against time. He immediately contacted Police Chief Robert Williams while rushing out of his chambers. "Robert, there's a situation involving one of your officers and my wife on Maple Street," Marcus said as he ran down the courthouse steps. "My daughter says Sarah can't breathe. Get there now." Across town, 3 police cruisers were already speeding toward the scene, responding to multiple 911 calls about an officer using excessive force. The crowd around Sarah and Officer Barrett had grown to nearly 50 people, all watching in horror as Sarah's struggles became weaker. She's passing out. The nurse in scrubs shouted, becoming more frantic. You're going to kill her. Emma was still in the car, clutching her mother's phone, alternating between crying and talking to her father who had kept the line open. Daddy, please hurry. Mommy's eyes are closing. The first police cruiser arrived with lights flashing. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez jumped out, immediately assessing the situation. She was a veteran officer known for her level head in crisis situations. Barrett, release her now, Rodriguez commanded, her hand on her own weapon. That's a direct order. Barrett, lost in his rage, didn't immediately respond. She's resisting. These people need to learn. The only one who needs to learn something is you, Rodriguez cut him off sharply. Release her now, or I will consider you a threat and respond accordingly. 2 more police cars pulled up, followed closely by an unmarked vehicle. Police Chief Williams had arrived. The chief's presence finally seemed to break through Barrett's haze. He loosened his grip, and Sarah collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The nurse rushed forward, checking Sarah's vital signs while Rodriguez pulled Barrett away. Chief Williams took in the scene, his face growing darker as bystanders rushed to show him their recordings. A black SUV screeched to a halt at the scene. Judge Marcus Thompson emerged, his usual composed demeanor replaced by raw fear and anger. He ran to his wife, who was still on the ground being attended to by the nurse. Sarah, baby, can you hear me? Marcus knelt beside her, taking her hand. Emma burst out of the car, running to her parents. Daddy, Mommy. She threw herself into her father's arms, sobbing. Barrett's face had turned ashen as he realized who Sarah was. The racial slurs he'd been muttering died in his throat as Chief Williams approached him. Officer Barrett, surrender your badge and gun, Williams ordered. You're suspended effective immediately. But Chief, I was just. Barrett started to protest. Just what? Marcus stood up, his voice carrying the weight of his position. Just choking my wife in front of my daughter? Just using excessive force and racial slurs? Just violating multiple department policies and constitutional rights? Sarah was beginning to recover, her breathing steadying though her throat was badly bruised. The nurse had called an ambulance, which was now arriving on the scene. Your Honor, Chief Williams addressed Marcus. I assure you this will be thoroughly investigated. We have multiple witnesses and video evidence. It better be, Robert. Marcus replied, his voice cold. Because what happened here today isn't just about my family. It's about every family that's ever faced this kind of abuse of power. Barrett was led away by Rodriguez, his head down, finally understanding the magnitude of his actions. The crowd had grown larger, many people still recording, others talking to newly arrived news crews that had picked up the police radio chatter. As paramedics helped Sarah onto a stretcher, she managed to speak, her voice hoarse but determined. Marcus, we need to make sure this never happens again. Marcus held Emma with one arm while holding Sarah's hand with the other. It won't, baby, I promise you that. The morning's events had been traumatic, but they would become a catalyst for change. As Sarah was loaded into the ambulance, with Marcus and Emma following close behind, the videos of the incident were already spreading across social media. What Officer Barrett didn't realize when he decided to abuse his power that morning was that he had chosen the wrong family, not because of their status, but because they had the means and determination to fight back against systemic injustice. The story was just beginning, and Atlanta would soon learn that justice wears many faces. Sometimes it's a badge, sometimes it's a judge's robe, and sometimes it's the brave face of an 8-year-old girl who knew exactly what to do when her mother needed help. Lines. The emergency room at Atlanta General Hospital was buzzing with activity as Sarah Thompson was wheeled in for examination. Dr. Patricia Chen, the attending physician, carefully documented every bruise, every mark on Sarah's neck, taking photographs for medical records that would later become crucial evidence. Mrs. Thompson, can you follow my finger with your eyes? Dr. Chen asked, moving her index finger slowly from side to side. Sarah complied, though every movement sent pain shooting through her neck. The doctor's face remained professional, but her eyes reflected concern at the severe bruising forming around Sarah's throat. Outside in the waiting room, Marcus sat with Emma in his lap, the little girl finally quiet but still trembling. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing, calls from fellow judges, civil rights attorneys, and news outlets were pouring in. The video of the incident had gone viral within hours. "Daddy," Emma whispered, "is Mommy going to be okay?" Marcus hugged his daughter tighter. "Yes, baby. Mommy is strong, and the doctors are taking good care of her." He tried to keep his voice steady, but the rage still simmered beneath his calm exterior. Chief Williams arrived at the hospital, looking grave. "Your Honor, may I have a word?" Marcus nodded, asking a nurse to sit with Emma while he stepped aside to talk with the chief. "The footage is everywhere," Williams said quietly. "All major networks are running it. Barrett's personnel file has been pulled. There were previous complaints that were overlooked." The chief's face showed genuine regret. "I'm sorry, Marcus. We should have caught this sooner." Before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Benjamin Morris, the city's most prominent civil rights attorney. "Tell Sarah to stay strong. We're filing papers first thing tomorrow. This ends now." Back in the examination room, Dr. Chen was finishing her assessment. "Mrs. Thompson, you got significant soft tissue damage to your throat and neck. There's also minor trauma to your trachea. You'll need to rest your voice for several days, and we'll need to monitor you for any complications." Sarah nodded, wincing at the movement. A nurse helped her sit up, adjusting the hospital gown around her shoulders. The bruises were darkening, forming a stark pattern that matched Barrett's arm. Outside the hospital, reporters had gathered in force. The story was too powerful to ignore. A respected federal judge's wife, herself an accomplished attorney, choked by a police officer in front of her child. The racial implications, the abuse of power, the clear video evidence. It was a perfect storm that would force the city to confront its demons. Social media was exploding with the footage. The video had been shared millions of times, with celebrities and activists amplifying the message. #Justice for Sarah Thompson was trending nationally. Back in the hospital room, Marcus was finally allowed to join his wife. Emma ran to her mother's bed, carefully climbing up beside her. Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter, tears sliding down her face. "I'm so proud of you, baby," she whispered hoarsely to Emma. "You were so brave." Marcus took his wife's hand, his judicial composure cracking as he saw the dark bruises on her neck. "This stops here, Sarah. We're going to change things." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Maria Rodriguez, the sergeant who had intervened. "Mrs. Thompson, Your Honor, I'm here to take your official statement when you're ready. And I want you to know that not all of us are like Barrett. Some of us became officers to protect people, not hurt them." Sarah nodded slowly, squeezing Marcus's hand. She was an attorney. She knew the importance of documentation, of following procedure. Even through her pain, her legal mind was already working, thinking about how to turn this traumatic incident into meaningful change. Dr. Chen returned with discharge instructions, but was clear that Sarah needed to stay overnight for observation. As the sun set over Atlanta, the Thompson family huddled together in the hospital room, their personal tragedy transforming into a catalyst for change. Outside, protesters had begun to gather, holding candles and signs demanding justice. The city was watching, the country was watching, and in that hospital room, a family's pain was becoming a movement's purpose. Barrett's actions had been meant to intimidate and harm, but instead, they had awakened a force for change. As Sarah drifted into an uneasy sleep, with Emma curled up beside her and Marcus standing guard, the wheels of justice were already turning, preparing for a battle that would reshape the city's approach to law enforcement and racial justice. The morning after the incident, Atlanta woke to a city transformed. News vans lined the street outside Atlanta General Hospital, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. Inside, Sarah Thompson was preparing to be discharged, her neck still badly bruised but her spirit unbroken. The hospital's PR team had set up a small conference room for a press briefing. Benjamin Morris, the civil rights attorney, arrived early to coordinate with Marcus. The two men had known each other for years, but this was different. This was personal. The bodycam footage just got released, Morris informed Marcus, showing him his tablet. "It's worse than the cell phone videos. You can clearly hear Barrett's racial slurs, and the timestamp shows he didn't even attempt to write a ticket. This was a targeted stop." Sarah sat in a wheelchair, as per hospital policy, watching the footage with steady eyes. Emma was at her grandmother's house, shielded from the media circus. The little girl had barely slept, waking up with nightmares throughout the night. We've received calls from every major news network, Morris continued. CNN, MSNBC, Fox, they'd all want exclusive interviews. But there's more. He paused, scrolling through his phone. 5 other women have come forward. All black, all professional women, all claiming Barrett harassed them during traffic stops. 2 of them filed complaints that were buried. Chief Williams entered the conference room, looking like he hadn't slept. Judge Thompson, Mrs. Thompson, I'd just come from an emergency meeting with the mayor. Officer Barrett has been terminated, effective immediately. We're cooperating fully with the state investigation. Sarah spoke, her voice still raspy. It's not enough, Robert. 1 officer fired won't fix this. We need systemic change. Marcus nodded, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder. The department needs a complete overhaul of its training and accountability procedures, and we need to know who buried those complaints. Outside, the crowd of supporters had grown. Community leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens held signs reading "Justice for Sarah" and "Black Lives Matter." The incident had struck a chord, highlighting how even success and status couldn't protect Black Americans from police brutality. Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at the door. Mrs. Thompson, several officers want to make statements supporting your case. They're tired of covering for bad cops. Barrett's actions, they've broken the blue wall of silence. The press conference was scheduled for noon. Sarah insisted on standing, despite the doctor's recommendations. She wore a silk scarf that couldn't quite hide the bruises, but she didn't try to conceal them. They were evidence of what needed to change. Marcus spoke first, his judicial demeanor masking his anger. What happened to my wife is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a deeper problem. Today, we're announcing the formation of the Thompson Justice Initiative, dedicated to police reform and accountability. Sarah stepped to the microphone, her voice quiet but firm. Yesterday, I was just a mother taking her daughter to school. Today, I stand here as a symbol of what needs to change, but I am also an attorney, and I know the law. What happened to me was not only morally wrong, it was criminal. The cameras flashed as Sarah continued. Officer Barrett didn't know I was a judge's wife. He didn't know I was an attorney. He saw a black woman in a nice car and made assumptions. Those assumptions could have cost me my life, traumatized my daughter, and destroyed my family. How many other families have suffered in silence? Benjamin Morris then outlined the legal action they were taking, not just against Barrett, but against the Department for negligent supervision and the systemic burial of complaints against problematic officers. The press conference ended, but the story was just beginning. As Sarah was wheeled out of the hospital, surrounded by family and supporters, she saw something that gave her hope. Police officers in the crowd, holding signs supporting her cause. Change was coming, and it was coming from both outside and within the system. In the car ride home, Marcus held Sarah's hand. You know this fight won't be easy, he said softly. Sarah looked at their intertwined fingers, thinking of Emma, thinking of all the other mothers and children who had faced similar situations with less fortunate outcomes. Nothing worth fighting for ever is, she replied, her voice getting stronger with each word. But we're going to fight anyway. 1 week after the incident, the Thompson family's living room had been transformed into an impromptu command center. Legal documents covered the coffee table, laptops displayed news coverage, and a whiteboard tracked the growing number of complaints against Officer Barrett. Benjamin Morris sat reviewing files with Sarah, who was finally able to speak without pain. Look at this pattern, he said, spreading out documents. Barrett's traffic stops targeted black women specifically, doctors, lawyers, business executives. It was like he was trying to put successful black women in their place. Sarah nodded, her fingers unconsciously touching the fading bruises on her neck. How many complaints were buried, Ben? We've found 23 so far, Morris replied grimly. And Internal Affairs just discovered who was helping hide them. Lieutenant Michael Peterson, Barrett's direct supervisor, was deleting complaints before they could reach higher authorities. Marcus entered the room, hanging up his phone. That was Chief Williams. Peterson just resigned rather than face investigation. He's trying to cut a deal. He's willing to expose other officers involved in covering up misconduct. The doorbell rang. It was Sergeant Rodriguez, carrying a thick folder. Mrs. Thompson, Judge Thompson, you need to see this. We found Barrett's personal computer during the investigation. He was part of several private social media groups sharing racist content and coordinating harassment of minority motorists. Emma walked in from the kitchen, stopping when she saw the serious faces. Though she was going to therapy to deal with the trauma, she still grew anxious when she saw her mother looking worried. Sarah quickly shifted the papers aside, opening her arms. "Come here, baby." Emma curled up next to her mother on the couch. "Remember what we talked about? Sometimes bad things happen, but we can turn them into something good." "Like how you're helping other mommies who got hurt?" Emma asked softly. "Exactly," Sarah smiled, hugging her daughter close. Morris's phone buzzed. Another victim had come forward. This time, it was a black female judge from a neighboring county. She had been too afraid to report Barrett's harassment, fearing retaliation. "The corruption goes deeper than we thought," Rodriguez said, pointing to documents. "There's evidence of a whole network of officers across multiple precincts who were targeting minority professionals. They called it attitude adjustment." Marcus paced the room, his judicial composure slipping. "This isn't just about Barrett anymore. This is systematic harassment sanctioned by supervisors who were supposed to prevent it." Sarah stood up, walking to the whiteboard. "Then we expand our scope. The Thompson Justice Initiative needs to address not just individual acts of misconduct, but the system that enables them." The investigation was making waves beyond Atlanta. National news networks were running special reports on police targeting of successful minorities. Civil rights organizations were providing additional resources and legal support. A photo of Sarah's bruised neck had become a symbol of the movement, appearing on posters and social media. But Sarah insisted on sharing the stories of other victims who hadn't had her resources or platform. "Every story matters," she told a reporter. "Every woman who was afraid to drive to work, every mother who had to explain to her children why the police treated her that way. They all deserve justice." The evidence against Barrett and his collaborators was mounting. Text messages revealed coordinated efforts to intimidate black professionals, particularly women. Body camera footage showed a pattern of escalating confrontations. As evening fell, the team was still working. Emma had fallen asleep on the couch, peaceful despite the serious conversations around her. Sarah watched her daughter, remembering her bravery during the incident. "We're not just fighting for justice anymore," she said quietly to Marcus. "We're fighting for her future, for a world where she won't have to fear the people who are supposed to protect her." Marcus wrapped an arm around his wife. "And we're winning. Peterson's cooperation is just the beginning. The whole corrupt system is starting to crumble." Sarah looked at the whiteboard, now filled with connections and evidence. What had started as one horrific incident was exposing years of systematic abuse. Barrett's attack hadn't just picked the wrong victim, it had triggered an avalanche that would change law enforcement in Atlanta forever. "Tomorrow," Sarah said, her voice strong and clear, "we start presenting our findings to the grand jury. It's time for everyone involved to face justice." The federal courthouse stood tall against the morning sky as Sarah Thompson walked up its familiar steps. This time, she wasn't entering as an attorney, but as the key witness in what had become Atlanta's most significant police corruption case in decades. Inside the grand jury room, Sarah faced 23 citizens who would determine whether to indict Barrett, Peterson, and 12 other officers involved in the systematic harassment campaign. Her voice mourning. "I couldn't breathe," she testified, her hand unconsciously touching her neck. "But what haunted me most was my daughter's screams." Emma watched an officer of the law try to choke her mother to death over a non-existent traffic violation. The evidence was overwhelming. Benjamin Morris presented a timeline of harassment spanning 5 years. Lieutenant Peterson's testimony revealed a disturbing pattern, officers specifically targeting successful black women, sharing their photos in private group chats, and coordinating traffic stops to humble them. They called it attitude adjustment. Peterson admitted, avoiding eye contact with his former colleagues. Barrett was just the most aggressive about it. "We buried complaints because it was part of the culture." During a break in proceedings, Sarah stood in the courthouse hallway with Marcus. Through the windows, they could see protesters still gathering daily, holding signs demanding justice. The Thompson Justice Initiative had grown into a national movement. "The FBI just called," Marcus whispered. "They're expanding the investigation to 3 neighboring counties. Similar patterns of harassment have emerged." Sarah nodded grimly. It was never just about one bad officer or one department. This was systematic intimidation designed to make successful minorities feel vulnerable. Back in the grand jury room, more victims testified. Dr. Michelle Carter, a prominent surgeon, described being held at gunpoint during a traffic stop. Professor Janet Williams recounted being dragged from her car while her students watched in horror. Each story followed a similar pattern: successful black women targeted for harassment under the guise of routine traffic enforcement. The technical evidence was equally damaging. Digital forensics had recovered deleted messages showing officers planning their harassment campaigns. Body camera footage revealed a pattern of escalating aggression specifically directed at minority women professionals. They chose their targets carefully, Morris explained to the grand jury. Women who had risen above their station, as they put it in their messages. They wanted to remind these accomplished professionals that their success couldn't protect them. During her final testimony, Sarah addressed the grand jury directly. This case isn't just about what happened to me. It's about every woman who was afraid to drive to work, every mother who had to teach her daughter to fear those sworn to protect her, every professional who questioned whether success made her a target. The deliberations lasted 3 days. When the grand jury foreperson emerged, the courthouse fell silent. 27 indictments were handed down. Barrett faced attempted murder charges. Peterson and others were charged with conspiracy, civil rights violations, and obstruction of justice. The investigation was expanding, reaching into other departments and jurisdictions. Outside the courthouse, Sarah stood before the media with Marcus and Emma by her side. "Today marks a beginning, not an end," she declared. "The Thompson Justice Initiative will continue working until every officer who abused their power faces justice, and every department implements real reforms." Emma squeezed her mother's hand as cameras flashed. The little girl who had been so traumatized was finding her voice, speaking at youth rallies about standing up to injustice. Later that evening, at home, Sarah received a call from Chief Williams. "The mayor just approved our comprehensive reform package," he reported. "Mandatory body cameras, civilian oversight, implicit bias training, everything you recommended. We're also establishing a special unit to investigate complaints against officers, staffed by independent investigators." As Sarah shared the news with her family, she reflected on how a moment of terror had transformed into a movement for change. Barrett's hatred had unwittingly exposed a system of corruption that had festered for years. "Mommy," Emma asked, looking up from her homework, "are the bad police officers going to jail?" Sarah hugged her daughter close. "Yes, baby, but more importantly, we're helping make sure there are fewer bad officers and more good ones who will protect everyone equally." The indictments were just the beginning. The real work of reforming police culture and rebuilding community trust would take years. But looking at her daughter's hopeful face, Sarah knew it was worth every moment of the fight. 1 year after the incident that changed Atlanta, the Thompson family stood together at the opening of the Thompson Center for Police Reform and Community Justice. The modern building, funded by settlements from the lawsuits and community donations, represented hope for a better future. Sarah, now fully recovered physically but forever changed, cut the ceremonial ribbon. The crowd included many familiar faces, survivors who had come forward, officers who had chosen justice. "A year ago, I couldn't breathe." Sarah began her speech, her voice strong and clear. "Today, we all breathe easier knowing that justice isn't just a word on a courthouse wall, it's an action we must take every day." Former Officer Barrett had been sentenced to 15 years in prison. Lieutenant Peterson and 11 other officers received varying sentences for their roles in the harassment campaign. More importantly, the investigation had sparked a nationwide review of police practices. Emma, now 9 years old, sat in the front row, beaming with pride. The trauma of that morning had left its mark, but therapy and her family's strength had helped her heal. She had even started a kids' group called Young Voices for Justice, helping other children affected by police misconduct. "The real change," Sarah continued, gesturing to the new building behind her, "isn't just in the policies we've changed or the officers we've removed. It's in the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve." The Thompson Center would house a civilian oversight board, training facilities for police reform, and support services for victims of police misconduct. But its most innovative feature was the Bridge program, bringing officers and community members together for regular dialogue and understanding. Marcus stepped up to the podium next. This center represents more than just oversight. It represents transformation. Every officer who walks through these doors will learn that true strength comes from protecting, not intimidating. True authority comes from respect, not fear. Chief Williams, who had become a strong ally in reform, nodded from his seat. Under his leadership, the Atlanta Police Department had become a model for change. Body cameras were now mandatory and monitored by civilian reviewers. Traffic stops required detailed documentation and regular pattern analysis to prevent targeting. Sergeant Rodriguez, recently promoted to captain, led the department's new Internal Affairs Division. "We've learned that being silent about misconduct doesn't protect the badge. It tarnishes it," she told reporters. "The thin blue line shouldn't protect wrongdoing. It should represent the barrier between chaos and justice." The Thompson Justice Initiative had expanded to 15 cities, each implementing similar reforms. Sarah's legal team had helped draft new legislation setting national standards for police conduct and accountability. After the ceremony, Sarah walked through the center's halls, touching the walls that displayed photos and stories of survivors. Each one represented a voice that had been silenced but was now heard. Each story contributed to the change they had achieved. Emma tugged at her mother's hand, pointing to a special exhibit, her own story, told through a child's eyes, alongside resources for young people affected by police violence. "Look, Mommy," she said proudly. "Now other kids will know they're not alone." Sarah hugged her daughter, remembering how that terrible morning had started with a routine school run. "You're right, baby. No one is alone in this fight anymore." The day ended with a community dinner in the center's courtyard. Officers sat with civilians, sharing meals and stories. Young police cadets listened to community elders. Children played safely, no longer taught to fear those in uniform. As the sun set over Atlanta, Sarah watched the diverse crowd mingling freely. Barrett's attempt to intimidate her had instead created a movement that was changing the very nature of policing. "We did it," Marcus said softly, joining his wife. "No," Sarah corrected him, smiling. "We're doing it. This is just the beginning." The Thompson Center's lights illuminated the gathering darkness, a beacon of hope for a city healing its wounds. Inside its walls, the next generation of police officers would learn a new way to serve and protect. In its meeting rooms, communities would find their voice. And in its very existence, it stood as proof that justice, though sometimes delayed, could not be denied. As the family drove home that evening, Emma spotted a police car and didn't flinch. Instead, she waved at the officer, who smiled and waved back. It was a small gesture, but it represented everything they had fought for, a world where law enforcement inspired trust rather than fear, where justice meant protection for all, and where one family's tragedy had transformed into everyone's triumph.